Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education, or an episode where I interview a guest or multiple guests. In this week's interview, I'm speaking with Jorge Valenzuela, and in our conversation, we discuss the importance of engineering and STEM, situating computational thinking within a problem, getting started with computational thinking and computer science, project-based learning, incorporating social and emotional learning, SEL, in the classroom, and George's approach to professional development, and so much more. There are many different books and podcasts and other resources that are mentioned throughout this episode, and you can find those easily by going to jaredoleary.com and clicking on the podcast tab, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, and it'll take you directly to the show notes. In addition, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science resources on my website, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I create free curriculum for. And with all that being said, we will now begin this introduction by George.
Hey, I'm Jorge Valenzuela. I'm an education coach, author, and advocate based in Virginia. I travel all over the country, now virtually, of course, all over the world. And I get to coach educators in several heavy lifts. Some of the initiatives are STEM, computer science, equity and SEL, project-based learning. But I do that through instructional design and through teaching practices.
So if you were to write a story about your life, what would the title of the chapters be?
So one of the things that I'm working on now is figuring out what people need. As a podcaster, I have a show producer. And so our show producer is very much in tune with the research and what audiences want. And so what I'm learning is that we can't be pretentious, or we shouldn't be pretentious. If we are, then the audience will eat us up eventually. And second, we have to hit on their pain points. And so what I would do is I would write a book where I would share my personal insights on things that I know plague other people. And so the introduction would just, basically be my why for writing this book. Two, what I've seen is that folks really need to get a handle on emotions and being able to loop into their current emotions, especially the ones that really trouble them. And so I say chapter 1 would be all about emotional intelligence, helping people with their personal, but also their social competence, because we really need both. Chapter 2 would be about finding your passion. I think that with most of the people I've seen or that I've met is that you're struggling to find happiness and to find joy. And so I think that if you focus on things that you enjoy doing, then you'll be happy, right? And so if you find that one thing that you really love the most and become an expert at that thing, then not right away, but eventually other people will seek you out on that expertise. There's a book named Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he basically tell stories about folks that are at the top of their field or were at the top of their field, like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, people like this. And so he's basically saying that they all have the 10,000 hour rule in common, which means that they spend 3 hours a day, 20 hours a week or more over 10 years on their craft. And so if you become an expert at your passion, then you'll be able to flip that into a purpose by helping other people. And so that is chapter 3. I'm not sure exactly what the other chapters would be at this point, but I just think that that would be a helpful thing for educators. It provides a framework and some steps.
Yeah, I like that. One of the things that I'd recommend for like high school students when I used to teach that is they would ask, well, I don't really know what I want to do in life. And my recommendation at the time was, well, what are you passionate about? How can you find a way to support yourself through that passion? Whatever it may be. If you're really interested in making music, awesome. There are many ways that you can make money doing music, not just as a performer. Maybe you also enjoy writing. Maybe you could write about people who perform and you could become a journalist and travel the world doing that. Like there's many different unique things you can do when you look at your passion from different perspectives and whatnot.
Yeah, that's true, man. Yeah, I think that a lot of people, if they focus on their passion and flipping it into a purpose and helping other people, I think that they would eliminate a lot of their sadness.
What comes to mind when you think of what an engaging learning experience might look like or sound like?
Well, Initially, I would have to say PBL, but that's, because of my own experiences, right? Project-based learning really offers educators a framework, when done right, for defining the student experience, intellectual challenge and accomplishment, collaboration, reflection, working with others, public products. These are things that a young person, or really any person, would need in order to get the most out of learning. And so I don't think that we can really do that if we have a textbook and a lecture, if we're reading books only alone. I think that learning experiences have to be well designed. And once they're well designed, adjustments can be made therein.
I'm wondering what experiences in education led you to answer that particular way, because I also agree, but I'm curious, like, do we align with some of our experiences or do we diverge, etc.?
Oh, no, no. So I used to be a curriculum specialist in a former life. And so what that means is that I was responsible for, I'd say, about 40 teachers. I was responsible for their curriculum, for how it's taught, PD, conferences, everything, you name it. And so when I became a curriculum specialist, I was 33 years old and I was pretty naive. I thought that every teacher understood exactly how to teach STEM, how to plan it, how to facilitate it, and really how to seek out resources. And so I was wrong about that. And I found out that I was wrong when our school district decided to use Understanding by Design, UBD, as a template for lesson planning. And so that's backward design planning. And I was realizing that what I was reading on the lesson plans on some of the teachers really wasn't STEM, but really wasn't understandable
Hmm.
in the beginning. And so I said, okay, let me write my own lesson plan. And as I was writing it, I realized that I didn't fully understand what was going on myself. Meaning, at the time, I didn't understand what scaffolding was, what learning goals, how to write learning goals, I should say. And so I started to seek out my other counterparts in other counties in Virginia. And so I reached out to Virginia Beach and I met with a few of the specialists. We had Skype back then. That was a few years ago, almost a decade ago, actually. And that's when they said to us that if you want to do experiential learning, learning by doing, and also with reflection for metacognition, then you need an instructional approach. STEM is just, I wouldn't call that a framework. I forgot how it was mentioned, but it was just more, aligning for different disciplines and engineering, basically doing engineering and aligning disciplines. And so what you need is an instructional approach, a methodology for how to teach. And so that's PBL. I hadn't heard of it back then. And so I sought out resources and I realized that it's something that, number one, is research based. Two, you have to learn it. Three, you have to practice, teaching with it. And then eventually it becomes an expertise. Yeah. So it's not a one, two, three thing.
How do you conceive of STEM? So some people think of STEM as, oh, it's the intersections of science, technology, engineering, and math. But other people see it as, oh, well, kids have a science class, then they go to a technology class, then they go into engineering class, as these like separate silos.
No, it's engineering. Has to be engineering. If there's no engineering design process, meaning that I have a challenge or I have a problem that I'm trying to solve. And so if I don't have a methodology for solving the problem, like an engineer, then it's not STEM. And so, it doesn't matter what the problem or the challenge is. The engineering design process, that should stay the same. Now, based on the problem, so let's say if I'm, building a race car, so the scientific principles that I'm thinking about have to really be around energy forces and motion. If I'm building a tower, then the science is really about how different materials absorb forces. So you see, science will change based on whatever the problem is. And so will math, right? Math is applied science. And then whatever tech I'm using, it really depends on what the problem is. But the engineering part should stay the same.
And where do you see computational thinking and computer science kind of fitting within that?
Well, we're always using electronics, right? And so we're always, coding and programming, even if it's like robotics or something like that. That's a very simple thing. But there you'll see that there's an aspect of computer science that's involved there. There's another discipline, it's called mechatronics, mechanics, electronics, and computer science, and also mechanical engineering. But what I'll say is this: computational thinking is a problem solving methodology that's used in computer science when you're coding or when you're programming. The same way, engineering has an engineering design loop, right? And so I'll back up even more. Every discipline has a methodology for solving problems. In education, we widely use Bloom's, right? And I think that a lot of other thinking frameworks, and really we can say it's a problem solving framework or it's a thinking framework. But every framework for teaching young people how to think and how to solve problems, in my opinion, really borrows from Bloom's. And so, what I like to use is basically three major verbs: analysis, synthesis, evaluation. So, everything I'm doing in any workshop, in any of my teaching, I'm having educators or young people analyze. Either I'm modeling, I'm explaining, I'm providing an artifact, whether it's a video, article, paragraph, whatever. So they're analyzing this. They're taking that knowledge and now they're synthesizing or they're designing. You see that? And then what the evaluation is reflection for metacognition. And so in science, right, we don't use Bloom's, but we use aspects of Bloom's in inquiry design or in engineering design. Inquiry design is for the natural world, plants and animals. Engineering design is for the physical world. And so in history, we can use something like design thinking. In math, there's so many other strategies, thinking routines. But for computer science, it's computational thinking. And so if we teach young people how to teach like a computer in terms of a framework, decomposition, abstraction, pattern recognition, and algorithm design, then when we teach them how to code, they'll already understand how the computer thinks. And so it starts out as a framework, but after practice and through repetition, it becomes a mindset. And so that's what's needed.
I like the idea of the problem solving as kind of being like a structure that kind of informs what you do within it. But what about if somebody is like, I want to express myself. So going back to what you're talking about with like the emotional intelligence and social emotional learning, like if somebody is like, I want to make music that's relaxing, like is the problem solving more of like the micro that is not necessarily driving things, but is like, oh, I ran into a bug, or oh, this doesn't sound good, let me try and solve that. But the overall thing that is guiding the project is the like desire to create.
So projects or problems are guided by a theme. What are we trying to accomplish, right? And so that is just my project is focusing on making music. And so I want to make a relaxing song. So how can I compose a piece of music that is relaxing and soothing and helps me, relax, right? Something like that. Like I'm thinking of what you said. And so that is what your problem is. And so there's some sort of data collection that you have to figure out, or, research where you're figuring out, well, what makes music relaxing or what do people respond to? So you don't really use a thinking framework like computational thinking there. You would use there some type of qualitative research methods like interviews, right? Research skills. Now, while you're actually composing the music, I wouldn't use computational thinking for that. I would use whatever music design process that composers use. I would use that there. Computational thinking would be if I'm coding.
Well, I mean, you could like in Scratch create music through code, or Sonic Pi, which uses Ruby, create music through that. So like to frame it, like I want to code infinite relaxing music through one of those platforms where it like randomly makes music that makes me chill out.
Oh, okay. So you're not composing music. You are pulling music that's already composed, pieces already composed, and you're putting them into an algorithm so that they pop up at in certain different places.
Oh no, like you're composing. So let's get extra nerdy. So let's say you create an array of like potential notes. Like this is my scale or my mode that I'm going to play.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to have it so that the algorithm randomly chooses which notes within that array is going to like play in the sequence, etc.
You asked the wrong guy for that. I thought that you were really thinking about like, composing music like on sheet paper.
So, like, in those intersections, though, like, it's interesting to think about, like you mentioned, yes, there are some frameworks that you can go through for composing, but when you are composing music through code, then, like, there's that computational thinking aspect that goes into it.
Well, that applies then.
Right.
And so you'll have to design algorithms. And so in those algorithms, you will definitely, like how you said, like, build your arrays, I guess, define where you want certain things played in your computational thinking process. I would recommend some flowcharting. I think that if you flowchart out the process, it'll definitely help you in coding exactly what you want to happen. And I think that's really what it's all about. If you're making a program, you definitely have to start with the problem, with the solution, and then you code it. And so I think that that's a skill that is often overlooked. Having a design team of students really write down what the problem is, what you're trying to really accomplish. And that's where, computational thinking comes in. It comes in a lot of times unconsciously, where we automatically, match patterns, abstract information that's not really needed. And then once we have that, then I think, step two is, defining the problem is to, in pseudocode, just in regular language, map out each of the algorithms or each of the steps, and then flow charting it with universal symbols. So we know what the inputs, the outputs, the loops, and the variables and all those things are. And then we can, code it and then, test it, evaluate it, and debug it.
If I can reframe it just kind of as a check, the way that you're describing computational thinking is it's situated within problem solving. It is used to solve a problem. There's a purpose to it. Is that?
Yeah, it can't be the focus of the project.
I love that. Definitely resonates. It's not out yet, but I just did an interview with Mitch Resnick. And one of the things that we talked about is like the problems with computational thinking where people look at it as, oh, this is just thinking. That's all we have to think about. And it's devoid of application of understanding, like you mentioned with problem solving. So I love that you're contextualizing it that way. But I'm wondering, what do you wish more people understood about that computational thinking?
Well, they have to actually get in there and do and solve problems, computational problems. If they're not doing that, then they can't explain what I just explained. So there's something in science that we call empirical evidence. It's a knowing from the senses, it's a knowing from experience. And so if you're solving computational problems and you're using this framework, then initially it'll be a struggle. But with that struggle comes knowledge construction and then the understanding of what that is. And then you'll be able to explain it now to someone else. If you don't do that, then it's just a bunch of major concepts. And so I can't really see how a project would be about those, major concepts. It's a problem solving strategy or a set of strategies. And so you need to have a problem first. And so I love what you said about music. I didn't really know that you were trying to design a program for music. That's why I said I wouldn't use computational thinking. But once you said, yeah, I'm writing a program, then that's a whole different thing.
So if somebody is interested in this, they're like, all right, computational thinking, computer science, this sounds awesome. I want to learn more about it. I haven't experienced this in my own education. What advice would you recommend for getting started?
All right. So first things first, if you're an English, math, science, social studies teacher, you cannot dedicate an entire year's worth of your curriculum to this. I would start with one project a semester. And so a school year is typically 4 to 9 weeks. And so every 18 weeks in most schools, we would have a semester, right? And so I would do one project that is 2 to 3 weeks tops. And I would do whatever I can to make sure that whatever I have to teach is somehow aligned to that topic in computer science or STEM. And I wrote a book, it's called Rev Up Robotics. And so it's in the context of robotics, but the foundational learning or the skills or knowledge needed for computer science, engineering, and computational thinking for K through 16 are pretty much laid out in that book. And so I would start with some unplugged lessons. And so the book is filled with a bunch of those where any teacher can basically coach young people through computational thinking, but unplugged, right? And so they learn what the concepts are in practice. And then I wrote a chapter for each of the content areas, and I basically pulled out of the Common Core and the NGSS any of the standards that align to some type of computer science or STEM learning in the context of robotics, and then just doing a little project like that. And I think that when you start there, you are going to, number one, learn a lot. Number two, fail a lot. And then when you start next time, you're starting from experience. And so I think that that is very important. And if people do that, then it'll help them not create computer scientists. It takes like 25 years to do that, but you'll put an awareness into young people of how the technology around them works. A lot of young people think that, technology is magic, but it's not. A lot of programming, a lot of coding, a lot of computational thinking went into making these things. And so I think that when they get involved in a project like that, where they're designing, where they are programming, then it takes them out of that consumer mindset and more into that designer mindset. And there's so many different pathways within that someone can take. And I think that that's just the awareness that young people need. And honestly, I think that every person should learn some sort of design process and should learn to solve problems, no matter what the problem is, through a process, a systematic approach. And when that happens, you're essentially teaching them how to think, how to fish, how to learn, how to construct knowledge, and just be a better learner in general.
I'm wondering if we can put a spotlight on one of the things that you mentioned, being willing to fail a lot and the importance of that, especially if you are new to CS. Like, why is that an important thing to be willing to do as an educator and as a student?
Yeah, well, I think anyone that has ever accomplished anything that they didn't think that they could accomplish at some point in their life has realized that failing, well, learning from failures is part of the process. And so the reason why STEM learning is fun initially is because it's typically done through toys or what it appears to be a toy, where you're building something and it's got some built in missions or programs. And so it's fun. But when you don't fully learn how to use it through learning, right? Like it's more like, tinkering, then that novelty will wear off eventually. And then it's just boring after a while. It's the same thing over and over again. But when you're learning how to solve a problem through a process with that toy or with that technology, then you're going to fail because something like coding and like really any skill, but especially coding, it's an earned skill. It's not something you could just, pick up and do. There's certain concepts you need to understand. And the main ones are inputs, outputs, loops, functions, variables, and logic. If you don't understand these things, you'll never be a coder programmer. So if we learn those things, right, and then we learn how to fail through making a program, then eventually we start to develop expertise that we can show others or that we can transfer. We'll also realize that it's a field that, although the concepts and the foundational knowledge hasn't really changed, but the new technologies and everything that's happening and how it's used, that is always changing. And so you realize that you're always a beginner. But being a beginner with experience is a hell of a lot better than being a beginner with no experience.
Yeah, spoken with a lot of CS educators who, like, we all agree that debugging is one of those standards that even if you don't want to do that standard, you're going to run into it like every day. So it's just par for the course, especially when it comes to programming and whatnot. Thinking back to what you were talking about earlier with project-based learning, I'm wondering, what do you wish more CS educators understood about project-based learning?
That the product is not the project. The project is the entire process or the unit plan. If I'm writing a program, that's just a product, right? Or if I'm designing a robot that can do something, that's just a product. The project is I have a client, and the client wants me to design a product to do X, Y, and Z, right? So that is part of the process, right? Building the program is another part, but then presenting it, putting it out in the public. If it's something that, like, let's say there's a concern where, people need to know something, maybe making a public service announcement that has a call to action, things like that. That's a project, not the actual product.
Yeah, I like that the examples you gave, they're like situated within like a real world application. It's not just a project for a project's sake. It's like, oh, you might actually do this outside of class. So I've got a two-part question. So the first part is, when might you encourage CS educators to do project-based learning? But then the second part is like the flip of that. When would you not recommend doing project-based learning?
Yeah, so I would recommend to a computer science educator, I would do one project a semester. Anything new that you're trying out, I would only do it once every 18 weeks. And the reason why is because you're learning an entire new framework. So you're taking something you already do, like computer science, but now you're, building in, collaboration, reflection, intellectual challenge, things that you may not have thought about in the past. And so if you try to do that all in one shot, it'll be difficult. And so I'd say take one bite of the elephant at a time. And so if you do a project once a semester, then you'll be able to take parts of the PBL framework and start to integrate them or incorporate them into other lessons and other projects. And then eventually you'll be a better teacher, in my opinion. I wouldn't do PBL when you are preparing students for the AP exam. I just wouldn't do that. If I have a 90-minute block, 60 minutes would be PBL or projects, and 30 minutes would be, testing. And so I wouldn't do PBL on everything.
If we didn't have to think of AP as like guiding whether or not you would or would not do project-based learning, so just an ideal learning environment without having those external factors, would there be a moment where you would not recommend project-based learning?
No, I think PBL is good for all children. The research says it. It does work in the AP environment. I'm specifically stating if we're preparing for the AP exam.
Right.
Now, there is data from Edutopia, has a research arm called Lucas Educational Research. And so they did PBL with AP students in science and in social studies, and scores actually increased. I'm talking about when we're actually, test prepping. I wouldn't put that in the project, is what I'm saying. But no, PBL, it definitely works in AP classes.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification, because there's definitely research out there that's like, yes, you have to prepare for the test. If you're going to do it, you need to like practice taking the test, essentially.
I'm not saying that it can't be in a project, but I don't see how.
Right.
Yeah, but you can easily make time in a project to stop the project and to work on your test prep.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an either or scenario. I know, having worked with undergrads, they have a tendency to see, oh, I can only do this one thing and never anything else. It's like, well, no, it depends on the context and your goals and whatnot. I'm wondering, one of the earlier things that you mentioned, SEL, wondering if you could unpack more of what is SEL and then how do you integrate that into teaching and learning?
Yeah, so social emotional learning is what we use to help young people in developing their emotional intelligence skills. And so emotions are really part of everything. And so a lot of times when we're not emotionally intelligent or we don't have this intelligence, we really don't know how we show up emotionally in our social interactions or how other people, react to us. That's on a social level. On a personal level, we really don't know what is triggering our emotions. We don't know why we react the way we do or why we respond the way we do. And so I think it's important to just have a framework for that too. Or, number one, before the framework is to understand what emotions are and how they impact the mind, body, and behavior. And so, one of the things that I didn't know a few years back that really helped me out a lot is to understand that emotions precede feelings and feelings precede behavior. And so, when I got that piece of knowledge, I realized that I don't have to respond or react to every single emotion I'm experiencing, like anger, right? Like anxiety. There's nothing wrong with experiencing these things, but you have to find a way out of them, how to conquer them. And so I think that all educators and all students need to be able to, at any given moment, in any type of situation, in an accurate manner, identify what emotion or range of emotions they're experiencing at that time, and then finding strategies for restoring peace. Because we never really do our best work or be at our best if we're not at peace. And so you'll find, people that we call it, getting in the zone when they are doing something that they really love and they can do it for hours and hours and hours and they're so into it and they have a beautiful experience. Well, in that moment, right, you're experiencing joy. That's a happy emotion. How do we, get there? And you can't zen out, 24/7. It doesn't work that way. But you need to have a system, an algorithm for solving or looping back into the emotions of the day and then finding a way to restore peace.
How do you recommend educators learn more about SEL and how to help kids and whatnot? So, like, I've gone through therapy for many years. That has helped me to understand how to address like issues that I was having in my mind, but I don't necessarily know how to help kids who are going through things that I haven't been through. So, like, my wife is a trained therapist and is like really good at working with kids, but I don't have the understanding that she does. So, like, how did you learn about SEL, or how might you recommend others learn about it?
Yeah, so I wrote an article. It's called Three Steps Educators Can Take to Better Manage Emotions. And so here I share my story. And so I have a couple of teenagers. And honestly, I didn't know that I wasn't emotionally intelligent. I didn't know this a few years back. I was living through life, doing the best I can, and, and that's it. And I have a couple of teenagers. And as they got older, they started to pay me no, never mind. Right. Anytime I would say or do something that they don't like, they would just be like, you know what, whatever, I'm tuning me out. And so as a parent, that's pretty painful. It's not a good feeling. And so I knew that I had something I had to work on, but I wasn't sure what. And so there's a great quote by Lao Tzu: when the student is ready, the master appears. And so a few days later or a week later, not sure, I was reading an article on making first impressions by Dr. Travis Bradbury. And in the article, he talked about his book that he co-wrote with Gene Greaves titled Emotional Intelligence 2.0. I got the book on Audible. And well, when I read its title, Emotional Intelligence, it just jumped out at me. And you're a music guy. So you know that someone that is a creator, certain things jump out at them that don't for regular people. And so I got the book on Audible and it came with an appraisal. And the appraisal said that I got a 76 in my social competence. It pinpointed exactly where I was at. Okay. And Talent Smart is the organization that produced this book. And so they have a framework or 4 domains: is social competence for relationship skills and self-awareness for self-management skills. It's something like that. And so I just started there. In the article, though, I broke down what emotions are. In psychology, they say that the first step is labeling or identifying, right? And so after knowing what emotions are, and so I like Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions because it really shows the range of emotions, but it focuses on 8 basic ones: anger, anticipation, joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, and disgust. And so when you have a tool like that, and you're like, okay, so the emotions I feel or I experience on a daily basis are an amalgamation of those 8 main ones in tandem with other ones on the wheel, then labeling is not a problem. Once you've labeled, then you can find, strategies. It could be breathing, like one really great one is just to interrupt thinking. If you focus on breathing, you can't really, think at that moment. And so it's 3 simple breaths, right? And so that right there, it causes a pattern interrupt and allows you to see or to feel things in a more logical way, which is what we need. In the article, I talk about Dr. James Gross, and he's a researcher and he really has a great framework. It's basically a framework, it's the process model for emotion regulation. And so through practicing a framework like this, you can change how you emotionally respond to different situations. You see, how we respond to things is conditioning. We can uncondition ourselves with some work. And so that's important. And I've also realized, and becoming trauma informed as a teacher, is that there's emotional trauma, but there's psychological trauma. And so SEL is not meant to replace trauma informed therapy, right? It's not, but we can learn through SEL how to not re traumatize people and how to be more mindful and respectful of what their triggers are, but also helping them in coping. And with coping, that's a step into, therapy and eventually healing. Yeah, like anyone who has ever overcome a traumatic experience knows you need to feel it to heal it. And so that's an important thing.
And I really appreciate the mentioning that it's not like a replacement for therapy, but like thinking of students as humans and teachers as humans and understanding that they are going through a lot potentially and not just thinking of, oh, well, they did bad on this test. Like, okay, but why? What might be going on that might be impacting that?
Yeah. Honestly, I think SEL or emotional intelligence is more important than everything else. I don't understand how we left that out of the curriculum, but we're here now. And I'm so, so happy that it's something that we can focus on. I was focused on it a few years ago and I've mastered my emotions, pretty much. Even if I'm nervous or have anxiety, I know how to make them fly or how to make the butterflies, fly in the same direction now. But what I didn't think was that I would be helping other educators with that. I just thought it was a personal issue, something I had to work on. And after COVID, you know, I kind of realized that we're all human, right? And so we're all experiencing emotions. We all had to deal with, difficult ones. And I think it's a duty now to help others. That article I put into the chat, I wrote that in February of 2020. The original link is there, but on Medium, I published it April 8th. And so it was written pre COVID. And so I thought that that would be all the work I do on SEL or emotional intelligence. I thought that that was it. And I put it out as a story or an article just so that it can help someone, not thinking that I would eventually do more research into the topic along with equity and other, heavy lifts in education and to write a book about it, which Solution Tree is peer reviewing right now on equity and SEL. And so it'll be out sometime in early 2022. So I'm excited about that, but I never thought I'd be doing this. Never, ever.
It's weird how life heads in directions we never anticipated. Like with my background in music education, to think that I would be full time in CS education for several years, I never would have thought of that a decade ago. But
Well, you know, I don't know a lot about music, I'll be honest, but I know that a lot of it is digital now. And I know that it can be created on a computer, what I've heard. So that makes sense.
yeah, it's fun, at least for a nerd like myself. So you mentioned you didn't anticipate helping teachers with SEL. Like looking broadly at how you've helped teachers. A lot of it is through like professional development, consulting, and whatnot. You mentioned that you like to make professional development inspirational, actionable, and fun. And so I'm curious how you do that, because a lot of people, when they think of professional development, it's like, oh, it's this thing I have to go do to get my hours, and it's boring.
Inspirational, what I use is just, personal stories. One of the things that I've realized, in fact, very quickly in my PD journey as a facilitator, is that teachers hate it, not despise it, not like it, but hate it when the PD person is telling them to do something that he or she hasn't done themselves. So the inspiration needs to be from a personal story, some personal insight. And so you being a computer science teacher, you already know based on my explanation of computer science and computational thinking that you know that at one point in my life, I dived into this topic and I have hands on knowledge. Now, the music part, I didn't have, and I was honest with you. That's the part that's inspirational. A teacher will forgive you when you say you don't know something, but will never, ever forgive you or will have a hard time trusting you when you're BSing them. You see? And so the inspiration, I think, it comes from personal insight of practicing what you preach. Actionable. Well, it's got to be something that they can replicate, meaning that they need a step one, step two, step three. And so a common theme in my articles that you can Google is that everything is in steps. 3 steps to do this, 4 ways of doing this, 2 ways of whatever. And so that's how the workshops are all designed. Everything in logical steps. And so it's not that they get the same product, but they replicate the process and the success that I am putting forth. And so a way to do that is through instructional strategies and vetted educational protocols, just like in the classroom. And if you really think about it, if you go into the military, into a hospital, into a police station, there's a protocol for everything. And so in my workshops, I have a protocol for everything. And so it's actionable. And they can replicate that with their faculties or with their kids. And fun, I like to play music. So you'll be happy about that. But also, I do a lot of research in the intake calls and find out exactly what do these folks need? What do they like? What are they into? And so I try to uplift those things into the workshop. And so those words there are actually words that I've gleaned from lots of data collections, tons of data collections. These are the themes that people are finding in the workshop. You can actually go onto my webpage and there's a section or a page called Masterclass. And underneath it, you'll see testimonials. And so my net promoter score is pretty high. And so these words and data is gleaned from. So that's how I know that the workshop is actually this.
And I'll make sure to include links to that in the show notes. I'm curious, like, if we zoom out and look at education as a whole, like, what do you feel is holding back educators or the field, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think in education, we know what to do. I just don't think that we know how to do it all the time, starting with working together, collaboration. I think it's a sticking point for a lot of schools, a lot of PLCs. And I think that if schools just start with number one, what do we want to do to help our children? And every school has a different context. There are some similarities. I do agree with that. But every context is different. Every set of students, every group of students, every staff needs something different. And so I think just in recentering ourselves and having some shared agreements and developing them together, shared agreements and norms about how we're going to do this work and what we need in order to do the work as a team, I think it's what is really needed at this time, especially at a time right now where we don't know what's going to happen. Learning loss, testing, COVID, mask mandates, all these different things are hitting educators. I'll back up. Educators in the classrooms are on the front lines of what's happening in the home or not happening in the home, along with all the policy and all the mandates and everything that's happening in education, the standards, all these things. And so I just think that we need to work together and we need to really learn how to do that. And that's what's missing. When I say that we know what to do, We already know that it's PBL. We already know that, computer science is good for all students. We know SEL is important. Whether we agree or not, we all know that social justice, is an issue in America, right? Equity, all these things, but how to do it. That's the issue.
So how do you try and stave off like the burnout that can come with working in the field of education? Because there's like a lot being thrown at educators, like a lot of pressures. We're traveling before COVID. I know you're still doing professional development. Like, how do you try and prevent that?
Well, I think that what I do is I loop back to the things that I enjoy doing, but that I don't have time to do. And for me, it's hiking, it's sightseeing. One that I do a lot is eating out. I'm a big foodie, right? Stuff like that. What I do is I make time for those things right now on the weekends. Friday and Saturday, my wife and my two children, we map out something that we want to do in nature. It could be canoeing, it could be sailing, rowboating, whatever. Or it could be hiking. And then we find a restaurant, something that we've never tried before. And so we do that like on a Saturday. On a Sunday, it could be a pool day. It could be a game day, a movie day. But the whole point is to do something that you enjoy doing. And that's how you restore your emotional health and your burnout and your fatigue. You have to do something where your mind is no longer engaged in that workflow. And I think if you do that on a consistent basis, like for me, it's the weekends and it's after 9:30 at night, you know, and at 9:30 at night might sound funny to you or to someone listening, but I like to watch things that make me laugh, like the Golden Girls. I mean, it's true. The Jeffersons, Martin, shows that I like, humor that I like. And it takes my mind off the workflow. And the thing that I've realized is that it could be the resurrection. Work is going to be there. It's not going away. And so there's nothing wrong in, disconnecting for your own mental health.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. That's something that I had to learn to do and value. And it wasn't really until a therapist pointed it out, like, hey, you're not making time for yourself. All you're doing is working.
Yeah. And so one thing, like I was in Chicago last week and I did a gig there actually. And my wife said, you've done, I don't know what it's been, man. It's been since April 2020. I have been basically every week doing PT, just basically every week. And she said to me, you have not been on a real vacation a long time. So let's take 2, 3 days. It's in Chicago. Let's do something fun and no work. And so that was hard for me. It was very hard for me because I have a lot going on. And so, like, I sat down and I wrote down, so what do I want to do in Chicago? On my bucket list is to visit Michael Jordan's statue. And so we put that on the list. She wanted to do a boat ride on the Riverwalk. She wanted to go to the highest building. I think it was a Sears building, and to look down and see the whole, city. And so we did that for 3 full days in a lot of restaurants. And I realized that I need something like this 2, 3 times a year, not for an entire week or 2 weeks, maybe 5, 6 days if I can afford it or if I have time. But yeah, like you need something like that, or you can't really restore or heal emotionally or, mentally from all that's going on.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. I house sat from my parents like for a week, maybe a month ago, and just getting out of the summer heat in Phoenix and being able to get up into the forest area because like their backyard backs up to the forest. Like it was wonderful just to disconnect for that week. Need to do that more.
Yeah, like there's a power in nature. Nature has amazing restoring qualities. And so I think you just have to know what you actually need. I think John Spencer has the 4 R's, relaxation, restoration. I forgot the other two, but you just have to figure out what do you need for your own healing, whatever that is, physical, mental, spiritual, and make time for that. And if you don't, you will regret it eventually. And the people around you will probably not be in your life forever if you don't do that.
So the way that you've been discussing that, and then even how you described your professional development, like if I were to use one word that kind of really stands out, it would probably be the word intentional from an outside perspective. And I say that with like a compliment. That is something that really resonates with. I try and look at life from an intentional perspective and be intentional with time, finances, etc. I'm curious if you were to shift your focus on how you are intentional with improving yourself, either your knowledge of CS education or your abilities as a PD facilitator, how do you kind of practice and iterate on those abilities?
Yeah, so I created a blog series. It's called Lifelong Learning Defined for Peak Performance in Education. Right now, a lot of the focus has been on equity, SEL, and project-based learning in my work. Some computer science, basically those things, and also in environmental science has been a big focus. But I created a masterclass called High Quality Teaching for Peak Performance. And I want to lift up the elements of the framework. I haven't looked at it recently, so I don't remember everything. But these are the things that make up who I am and the way that I do all of my work. And so it's a framework. And so the first thing is this. And so as a PhD student, I learned that PhD students have to create knowledge, right? And so one of the things that I've been very blessed with is to be very consistent in my PD services for almost some 10 years now. And so using that in tandem with my knowledge in the PhD program, I've learned how to do my intake calls as semi-structured interviews. So I'm basically learning a lot about the organization, about the teachers, and what they actually need. And then after the workshops are designed based on this knowledge and also best practices, then I'm getting feedback surveys, right? And so I'm looking at what the teachers say. And so these two big steps over time make a framework. And so one of the frameworks that I've developed for peak performance and high quality teaching that really tell my story, but also I think other educators need, is to number one, really develop their emotional intelligence skills, personal and social competence, as we've been discussing. But two is to understand their own educational philosophy. Basically, know what they think about teaching and learning and how young people learn, right? And their why and all these things. But two is to adopt sound instructional design practices, meaning that they need to understand how to unpack a curriculum framework or unpack a project or an idea that they see online and also standards. They need to be able to create their own project and their own lesson. And then they also need to understand how to facilitate it. And so it's not just knowing how to write a lesson, but it's knowing how young people learn. And so being able to use protocols and strategies that help with cognitive demand in a way that isn't overloading, right? And so only a person that's a master in his or her content will be able to design those experiences. And so knowing what your content is, knowing the research, frameworks, major concepts that apply in whatever you're teaching, and then being able to, design good learning experiences. Five is to improve your knowledge of students. You can't be a culturally responsive teacher if you're teaching young people from different backgrounds and different cultures than yourself, if you don't know them. And so if you don't, get to know them, then you can't really help them. And so here's the thing, what we're trying to do in education, or what we should be doing, is creating learning partnerships. You can't do that if you don't have a relationship. And you can't have a relationship if you don't lead with empathy. So you have to get to know your students as far as their perspectives. For example, their interests, their goals, what they're good at, or their assets, and then their instructional needs. Six, as we all know, you need to be able to use ed tech to augment lessons. It's not that you lead with ed tech, but ed tech is used to enhance how a lesson is taught. And so in COVID, there's no way around it. We all know, that we have to focus on this. And so I like the TPAC model. It's a very strong framework for helping educators understand how their content knowledge, their pedagogical knowledge, but their knowledge of technology, how that can either blend or reblend at different times. And so that's a skill in itself. And so I think that that really goes back to instructional design practices. And lastly, is to become an advocate for your students. Whatever your students need, whatever those equity raisers are, you need to advocate for them. And that really starts with you becoming what they need you to be. So all those things over the years, lots of data collections, a lot of failures, a lot of working on myself. That's what I've come to.
I'm wondering, like, if we were to think broader than how you improve your own abilities, what do you feel is research that is missing in the field? And whether it's be research that you're doing for the dissertation or just in general that might be missing?
All right. So for my dissertation, it's a computer science focus. And so I did some research prior to. It's published in the Journal for Computer Science Integration. And so what I wanted to figure out was what is it that's holding back educators who aren't traditional computer science teachers, meaning it wasn't part of their undergrad. What is holding them back from teaching that and also computational thinking? And so I did some research around that. I interviewed, I want to say, 10 educators and from science, math, CTE, other areas. And what I basically realized is that because they don't have that in their background or in their wheelhouse, they struggle with two things: understanding major concepts in computer science, but also in how to facilitate it. And so, what I think is missing in my research as far as computer science goes, and really I think it applies to anything, is being able to activate that in lessons, whatever you've learned or whatever has to be lifted up. And so, that really goes back to instructional design practices. I mean, if you want to be a good teacher, based on what I've learned, there's two things you need to know how to do well, no matter what the discipline is. Number one, how to write your own lesson plans. You have to, taking into account, not just the standards and what the lessons are going to be, but also who's in your classroom. So how are you going to differentiate for them? How are you going to scaffold for them? What will your learning stations or your learning centers look like? That's why those 8 or 7 elements, why so many of them, because it's not just one thing. But being able to map a curriculum, hopefully backwards, and then being able to facilitate it using strategies that, again, take into account how young people learn. Learning happens along a continuum. New learning is built on old learning. And so a good teacher builds on that through scaffolding experiences. Everyone doesn't know that. And so I think that that research is already there, but I'm not so sure that it's lifted up in every field. And so in computer science, I definitely think it's needed, especially because we're asking educators that don't have an undergrad in CS to now teach CS. I mean, think of the return on investment for STEM education. Billions of dollars have been spent on STEM. In the NGSS, the NGSS is the first time that engineering design was elevated to the same level as scientific inquiry in the standards. They used engineers to actually develop the framework, but educators weren't really trained on engineering design. So what's the return on investment on that? We see that we're missing a STEM workforce, right? It's not what we need. Well, it's not where we'd like it to be. And so I think it's that. It's research on best way of activating these things in actual lessons or in the classroom. I think that the educational ship should always be guided by curriculum and instruction or instructional design practices for teaching and learning. No book, no speaker, no nothing, no business partner, no money should be spent if it's not enhancing CNI.
Yeah, I like that. Do you have time to talk about like what your recommendations are for equity and inclusion?
Yeah, for equity and inclusion, I really think that a staff needs to, as a PLC, needs to really, get together and make intentions about what their personal and also as an organization, what those intentions are for DEI work. And then make shared agreements about how that work is going to go. And then based on who's in the building, right? What different backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities, that they're servicing, they need to really be informed about the equity raisers of those folks. And so if not, and I don't mean that they get knowledge of it from a textbook or from the history book. No, in the narratives of those folks that have been marginalized. And then having a process for taking that and learning how to, as a team, create school-wide culture, climate, practices that are inclusive for all these folks and learning from the mistakes. And so when we do that as a PLC, then the educators in the building or the staff won't be afraid to do two things. Number one, speak from the heart, say what they feel. But number two, which is very important, is to not be afraid to get the feedback they need when their perspective needs some changing, especially if it harms other people. And so that's a process. And so I would recommend in getting someone from the outside when that team really needs to, start that hard work, and it's, long work. Like, it's not something that we just, do in one session or one workshop or one book study, but you bring in a person that is using research-based frameworks and models, number one. Number two, has checked his or her own biases. Three, has healed their own trauma. And four, knows how to create safe spaces and not shame colleagues. And so, that's just in a nutshell, in the research I've done and the work I'm doing. But I think that those are important elements.
Yeah, I like that. So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, lifelonglearningdefined.com, and also at George Does PBL. That is JORGE. And that's on TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, it's on there. And yeah, and that's it. And just drop me a line, send me an email, and we can chat.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you enjoyed this interview with George, and I hope you consider checking out the show notes to explore some of the free resources and to connect with George on the various different platforms that he mentioned. And you can find that at jaredoleary.com. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.